We're tracking reactions to US President Donald Trump's tweet on South Africa's land reform policy. In it, Trump says he's asked US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to study the South African government's land expropriation plans and the so-called large-scale killing of white farmers. South Africa's government is working out how to implement a system of land reform that is more equitable. While South Africa has reacted to the tweet, the government has called it divisive and is seeking clarity on the comment from the US Embassy. South Africa says it totally rejects the narrow perception of Trump's tweet, which it says seeks only to divide the country. The government has promised to speed up the pace of land reform in a careful and inclusive manner. Well, let's get you more on that story now from Johannesburg. I'm joined by CGTN's Angelo Coppola. Angelo, what more can you tell us about the South African government's reaction to Donald Trump's tweet on land reform?
Well, look, by mid-morning today, after that expected Twitter storm, the South African Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Lindiwe Sisulu, actually went out and noted, and her words were noting that Trump's unfortunate comments on Twitter need to be addressed. Those were her words. According to Sisulu, the tweet was based on false information. The presidency, a little later on, then said it had noted Trump's tweet, which they said was misinformed in their view. We understand that Sisulu has instructed senior South African government or diplomats to meet with US Embassy staff in Pretoria to get clarification on what Mr. Trump actually meant. Sisulu said earlier that she would also work through those diplomatic channels and talk to the US Secretary of State to get clarity there too. So we might have a developing diplomatic incident on our hands at the moment. And as to whether there will be a US presidential apology or not, or remains to be seen, or perhaps heard, or perhaps read. Lindy?
And of course, land reform is a hot topic in South Africa. Angelo, for the benefit of our viewers, explain, if you will, why land reform is such an emotional issue in the country.
Well, it's more about land ownership that's the emotive issue here. Many people living in or near urban areas live in squalor, in tin shacks, with little or no ablution facilities or infrastructure around them to make their lives easier. New urban residents have come in from rural areas where the situation is just as dire. In some instances, people are being kicked off their land that their ancestors had stayed on for many, many, many decades. And now land has become a political battleground. It's been driven by the Economic Freedom Fighters opposition party. The ANC strategists, of course, realized that the EFF were gaining supporters by calling for government and unused land to be given to South African citizens. The ANC got in on the act then, trying to regain some lost ground by supporting this EFF call earlier this year for constitutional changes allowing for the expropriation of land without compensation, something we've covered quite a lot in recent past. So it's now a political football with voters looking at what's being done to provide them with that service land. The President, in fact, alluded to this yesterday during his Q&A session in Parliament. So it's emotive, and we're hoping to see some kind of clarity and reform and movement in the very near future. Lindy?
And Angela, of course, Donald Trump used the phrase large-scale killings of white farmers in that tweet of his. Many analysts and experts have, of course, disputed this. But who is propagating this notion that white farmers are being killed en masse in South Africa?
Well, Lindy, look, the facts and the data are there. People are being attacked, maimed, raped, and killed on farms. Workers are also being targeted, sometimes by farmers themselves. The attacks happen on a weekly basis. According to data that is collected and shared by AfriForum, which is an Afrikaner activist organization based in the rural areas, some would question or dispute that it's at the level of genocide, but AfriForum have been calling for support from the authorities to properly police those farming areas. They're a bit stretched, obviously, the police are, considering the very high crime rates that we have in South Africa at the moment and have had for a couple of years now. And that, because of that, the group has now formed neighborhood watch groups to police those high-risk urban and semi-rural and rural areas. And they sometimes do work with local law enforcement to patrol and apprehend suspects that might be on prowling around looking for trouble. And they would say that they're doing the police services work. That's what they would tell you right now, Lindy.
Angelo Coppola, thank you so much for bringing us that perspective there from Johannesburg. Well, let's bring in another perspective on that story now. I'm joined from New York by our correspondent, Nick Harper. Nick, many people have been wondering, first of all, why Donald Trump is even interested in South Africa's land reform policy.
Well, I'm not sure the president actually is all that interested in their land reform policy. If we look at the history of the Trump administration, it has never had a strong foreign policy towards the African continent, let alone South Africa itself. And remember back to that controversy in January over those alleged comments about whether or not President Trump called African nations S-hole countries. But I think there are several other things at play here. We know that Donald Trump likes to watch Fox News often late at night, and last night in America, Fox News were playing out this segment looking at land reform, and just after that segment played out, Donald Trump tweeted about it. It was a rather one-sided look at events in which it called the South African government racist and immoral. We also know that President Trump likes to tweet things out that will play well to his voter base, and this is certainly one of those issues, this idea of white citizens being disadvantaged or taken advantage of. And also, we know, due to past history, the president often likes to concentrate on matters, sometimes as a diversion tactic, and there have been several things during the course of the last week that he wants to try and deflect attention away from. A couple of his former campaign employees, his campaign manager Paul Manafort, he was found guilty of tax and bank fraud, and his former lawyer Michael Cohen here in New York pleaded guilty to similar charges, and also said that the president had instructed him to make payments to two women who'd alleged affairs with the president. So I think really Donald Trump trying to move the narrative in a different direction. It just so happens that what he's chosen has been all about land reform in South Africa.
So a diversion tactic perhaps, but one that has certainly caused quite the backlash in South Africa. Do we know at this stage how Mike Pompeo will tackle this issue, if at all?
Well, that's unclear, and I think the if at all thing is something that we'll need to wait and see about. But this idea of Donald Trump sending out these tweets that play well to the base, that are sometimes rather incendiary in their nature, it doesn't always mean that that's going to be followed through. He has asked Mike Pompeo to look closely at land and farm seizures and the large-scale killing of farmers. It will be somewhat difficult for Mike Pompeo to be able to do that from the United States, and we also know that Fox News, they commented on this during last night's segment, they had a statement from the State Department which essentially sided with the South African government. The US State Department saying that they were aware of the issue and that South Africa is a strong democracy and the whole land reform policy is an open process. So it will be perhaps rather difficult to Mike Pompeo to follow through with this if he decides to do so.
And of course, Nick, you touched on this a little earlier, but just talk us through why this issue of the large-scale killings of white farmers is something that appeals to American audiences, or at least Fox audiences to be more precise.
Well, certainly it does. I mean, if you look at Fox News's demographic, it is a conservative, often Republican-leaning news channel. And we do know that the majority of Trump's supporters, the people who voted for him in 2016, are white citizens in America. We are at a time in the United States where we've certainly seen a rise of nationalism, protectionism, this idea of white citizens standing up for their rights and making sure that other white citizens aren't taken advantage of. During that time, for example, we've seen the rise of the alt-right, this white supremacy movement, who've very much been pushing this idea of whites having their ideas and their ideals well taken care for. So while we've been seeing this in the background rising in the United States, I think it is something that the president has noted. It comes at a time when we've got that in the background, and therefore he certainly has people who feel similarly that if there are other white citizens anywhere around the world who are being taken advantage of, it's something that should be noted and looked at carefully.
Well, Nick Harper, thank you so much for bringing us that perspective from New York.